Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to be breaking down the ICE shooting in Minnesota. And I'm not really going to be doing like a reacts where we're going to look at the footage and I'm going to tell you what I see or anything like that. I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible. It sounds like some of you guys want my 2 cents, just my thoughts about this, and also want me to try to keep it short. I've tried to do this video a couple times already, and it ends up going an hour and a half or so of just explanations of things because I tend to talk a lot, but also there really is a lot to know here. So these types of shootings historically in law enforcement have always been very controversial, and I want to kind of take you and give you a little crash course on some case law, some policy, a little bit of kind of analysis on previous police tactics from a couple articles I have here, and kind of give you a little crash course on the police academy, if you would. So I think that'll be helpful for you guys more than anything else, and that way you can look at the footage again and probably make a better, more informed decision on whether or not you think this was justified or not. I think at best this is a very murky situation. And that's been a little bit frustrating for me, just seeing the commentary around it and how politically charged this is, because people on both sides are just using this to their advantage. And there's all kinds of just not true stuff that's being said about this. So the first thing I want to go over is when a police officer or an agent can use deadly force. So this is something that I think is very important for us to go over, and that is when there is an imminent threat. That means it is going to happen of great bodily injury or death to that officer or agent in this case, or somebody else that they're trying to protect. Generally speaking, that's really the only time law enforcement can use force, with a few exceptions. And the only exception that is really widely used outside of this is going to be the fleeing felon rule, which is if somebody just committed a violent felony and they're believed to be armed and dangerous and they're trying to flee, I could use lethal force in order to stop them from fleeing. Now, what's important to note is that the force needs to be reasonable for the purpose of stopping the threat. Because I take out my gun and I point it at somebody, let's say they're coming at me with a knife, I take out my gun and point it at them, and then they drop the knife and put their hands up, I can't continue to use force because just me drawing my gun was enough of a show of force to gain compliance, and my goal is to stop the attack coming at me, and if they surrender, then the attack is stopped. It's not necessarily like, hey, you had your knife out a second ago, I'm going to take out my gun, and this is a death sentence for you now. That's not how it works. We, law enforcement, are there to stop the threat, not necessarily to shoot somebody or kill somebody or hurt somebody. Those are kind of byproducts of what happens when an officer is trying to neutralize a threat. But this is very, very important, obviously going to be relevant later. The whole point of using force is to neutralize a threat. And then there's a case, Smith versus Cup, and this just says that threats must be present at the time of the use of force. You can't continue to use force once that threat is gone. This is actually an interesting case because it is a similar case of an officer shooting at a car where the car passed him and he continued shooting at it, and that was ruled to be a violation of the suspect's rights because it was excessive. The threat was no longer there. So just officers shooting at vehicles or from vehicles is already very controversial. This has been around for a long time. The next thing I just want to mention really quick is how are these use of force cases sort of judged? Well, there's a couple big cases that are known in kind of the use of force police training community that establish a couple standards. So the first is called objective reasonableness, and that basically establishes a standard on how we judge these cases in a courtroom, and that basically means we have to ask ourselves, would a reasonable officer in this officer's position do the same thing? That's how things are supposed to be judged. So that's Graham versus Connor. And then also Barnes versus Felix. You can't just take the moment that the force was used and consider that. You have to consider the totality of the circumstances. So everything leading up to that, all the information the officer's got, and it's got to go based on what the officer believes at the time, not what we find out after the fact. We can't use 20/20 hindsight necessarily to judge these. The big takeaway from this is that using deadly force is to address a threat, and the goal is to eliminate that threat, not necessarily to shoot or kill anybody. And then the next one is you cannot continue to use force after the threat is no longer present. The next thing I want to talk about is the efficacy of shooting at moving vehicles. So this is why this is so controversial, because there are so many different articles that we look at and court cases that have come up over the years about this. This is not the first time something like this happened. I'm going to link a couple below. One is called Cops versus Cars from Police One. Another one is from Yale University called Cops Shooting at Cars, Really Bad Idea. And another one is a law journal that goes over a lot of the case law when it comes to different types of uses of force. So I'm not going to go into this because this is going to take too much time and I want to keep this video short. But this outlines a lot of things and explains a lot of things that I think are helpful to know in this particular instance. And these articles, the two articles that I mentioned here, they give some examples and they give some kind of professional opinion from people who are either in charge of departments or in charge of training, talking about how ineffective it is to actually shoot at cars. So let's say you want to stop a car as a police officer. If I stand in front of the car, vehicle versus officer, is that going to stop the driver? Is that going to stop the vehicle from moving? Well, of course not. No. Vehicle versus officer, the vehicle's going to win. So it's kind of dumb to put yourself in front of the car. This is something that officers have done for a long time, is like, I don't want them to leave, so I'm going to run in front of their car and stand in their way so they don't have an avenue without going to the level of a lethal force situation. So, and that kind of makes me, when I say it like that, it kind of sounds like entrapment a little bit. We're going to get to that. But I'm not talking about entrapment here. I'm talking about an officer's instinct to try to win the situation, and they throw themselves in front of the car to try to stop the car. But like, let's think about it for a second. That's super ineffective. Secondly, the biggest threat with moving vehicles is that you could get hit or run over. Obviously, that's the threat here, is that the officer could get run over and that could hurt or kill the officer or somebody else. So the question arises that does shooting the driver of the vehicle stop the vehicle? I think we see this in maybe movies sometimes, or maybe some very extremely rare examples. I haven't actually seen this actually work though, where the driver gets shot and the vehicle just comes to a stop right there. Typically, if a vehicle is in motion and you shoot the driver, you either harm them where now it's harder for them to drive, or you kill them where they're incapacitated. Now you have a vehicle that is uncontrolled moving down a pathway and it's going to crash into something pretty much inevitably. And that could be bystanders, that could be buildings, a pole, vehicles parked on the side of the road, that sort of thing. So these articles kind of sum that up, of how ineffective it is to shoot at vehicles. But because vehicles don't stop when you kill the driver and they don't stop when you put a body in front of it, it doesn't actually neutralize the threat. And that's the big issue here, is it's instinctual for an officer to shoot when they're feeling threatened. But the thing is, shooting at a vehicle does not eliminate the threat. It is not, these articles kind of allude to the fact that it's not appropriate. It's not the appropriate response that is actually going to solve this problem. It doesn't eliminate the threat. This is a situation that is potentially a deadly force situation where not shooting your gun is the better option. And that's the tricky thing with vehicles. The best option to eliminate a threat is for the officer to move. And that's what a lot of these, that's what these articles will actually suggest in here. Now, obviously, vehicles can be used intentionally to run people over. Officers are actually trained to do that in certain situations. I was trained to do that when I did the emergency vehicle operations course. But that can happen to officers too. And we have seen examples of that. There are videos of Phoenix cops that three of them that were coming out of a convenience store, and a car just plows right into all three of them. And it was very clear, just based on the behavior of that vehicle, you could easily articulate that they were targeted and the driver intended on hitting them with the vehicle. But I would say 90% of the time when that excuse is used, the driver is simply trying to flee. Fleeing is very common. Attacking an officer is very rare relative to fleeing. Fleeing happens all the time. Attacking an officer is pretty rare. I would have to think pretty hard, but just off the top of my head, I can't think of any time where I was actually attacked. I can only think of times when I got in fights with people because I was trying to catch them and they were trying to leave. Or they were trying to fight me off of them. They were trying to use force to get me off of them so that they can run off. It was situations like that. It was not situations where somebody targeted me and their goal is to harm me. That is very rare. It does happen. It happens too often, but it is very rare compared to somebody trying to flee. Again, I can't get into too much of this stuff. I'm really trying to go very fast through this. But because this is the situation, and because, courts and lawsuits have come to this conclusion that shooting at cars is not effective, law enforcement have looked at these cases and said it's not effective, and the best thing to do is to move out of the way. There's a lot of liability in these types of shootings where officers shoot at vehicles. So much liability that there are policy changes that have happened in agencies just all across the country. So there's a few policies I want to look at here when it comes to using shooting at vehicles. So we're going to talk about using deadly force. I'm looking at a policy from the DHS, which is apparently what ICE uses. Now, I don't know if this is the most up-to-date policy. I hear their policy reads a lot more like the DOJ policy, but I couldn't find that. Maybe it's out there. Let me know if you guys find something different than what I have here. But I'm just going to look at their deadly force general guidelines here. This is section 6, A1. Any use of deadly force must be reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances confronting the officer at the time the force is applied. And then section 2, LEO may use deadly force only when the LEO has reasonable belief that the suspect of such force poses an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to them or somebody else. So kind of the same thing that we've already established with case law here. Fleeing subjects, they say you can't use force against fleeing subjects, and they do leave room in there for the fleeing felon rule. Now, specifically with discharging firearms, which is the next section, section B1, discharging firearms is a use of deadly force and shall be done only with the intent of preventing or stopping the threatening behavior that justifies the use of deadly force. So again, going back to what we read in case law, this is the reason their policy is the way it is. You're not trying to necessarily shoot or kill somebody. You are trying to stop the threatening behavior, and you can only do it while that threatening behavior is present. Now, if we go to section B2, that covers moving vehicles. Now, this is the one I'm not sure is completely updated, and I'll explain to you why that is in just a second here. But it basically says, in this case, agents are prohibited from discharging firearms against the operator of a moving vehicle unless the use of deadly force against the operator is justified under standards elsewhere in the policy. Before using deadly force under these circumstances, the agent must take into consideration the hazards that may be posed to other agents and innocent bystanders by an out-of-control vehicle. Now, I am kind of paraphrasing here a little bit in this. I'll put a link to this policy so you guys can see what I'm looking at exactly here. But what's interesting here is even though it doesn't say you can't shoot at moving vehicles at all, it does say it admits what we talked about in the articles and in the lawsuits, that shooting a driver is not going to stop the threat. Right here, the agent must take into consideration the hazards that may be posed to other agents and innocent bystanders by an out-of-control vehicle. So they're basically admitting in this section here that shooting the driver doesn't necessarily eliminate the threat. And now remember, the reason we're shooting is to eliminate the threat, and shooting a driver doesn't eliminate the threat. And that's why shooting in a lot of agencies' policies are actually prohibited. Now, again, the policy for the agents that I found here doesn't necessarily prohibit that, but so next, let's go to the DOJ policy. Now, from just looking at Google, Google says that the DHS policy, which would apply to ICE, reads a lot like this now. I just couldn't find their most updated version in time for this video, and I wanted to put this out sooner than later. But under their policy, this is section 1-16.200 titled Use of Deadly Force and Prohibited Restraint Techniques. And in this section, section A2, there's a paragraph here that says firearms may not be discharged solely to disable moving vehicles. Specifically, firearms may not be discharged at moving vehicles unless, and here are the two conditions. Number one, a person in the vehicle is threatening the officer or another person with deadly force other than the means of the vehicle itself. That doesn't apply in this situation. Nobody's shooting from the vehicle or stabbing somebody in the car as the car is driving off or something like that. Number two, the vehicle is operated in a manner that threatens to cause death or serious physical injury to the officer or others. Could be that, but there's an and here. And, so you have to have this second part too. And no other objectively reasonable means of defense appear to exist, which would include moving out of the path of the vehicle. So that is extremely important right there, because that basically says you are not allowed to shoot at any moving vehicle, even one that threatens you, if you have the option of moving out of the way. So that's basically the DOJ policy there. And from what I hear from other people, what I'm reading online and from Google, Google says their policy is this policy here and reads basically the same way as this one. I just can't find their most updated version. I've looked several times and I don't know. I mean, only somebody else may be able to find that for me. Now, going back to what I had said earlier when I said it kind of sounded like entrapment a little bit, I want to talk about that in just a second here, and I'm going to lead into that by talking about officer safety tactics. Now, officer safety is basically things that we consider that officers do or don't do in order to maintain a safe situation, not only for the officers, but for the suspect and for the general public too. So this is kind of a general thing that we're trained on. And there are certain things that are no-nos. Stepping in front of the vehicle is a big no-no. That is something that we are trained not to do. Now, I looked in the policy that I found for the DHS, and under section 3C, there is a section called Use of Safe Tactics, and it's just a general officer safety section that there to use safe tactics. So agents should seek to employ tactics and techniques that effectively bring an incident under control while promoting the safety of agents and the public that minimize risk of unintended injury or serious property damage. Agents should also avoid intentionally and unreasonably placing themselves in positions in which they have no alternative to using deadly force. So basically, they are restricted in this policy, in a sense, from being careless with their tactics, from being put into a situation that is going to unnecessarily cause harm to somebody themselves or others, or create a dangerous situation. Now, I looked specifically in Google. I couldn't find their training documents, but I looked specifically in Google what they're trained to do, and they're trained to basically approach a vehicle in an L formation, meaning from the sides, not from the back or from the front. They're trained to avoid those areas. I was trained to avoid those areas as an officer too. So that is something that stuck out to me as a huge no-no. Like, you don't, especially if you're on a traffic stop, you don't walk in front of the suspect's car. You don't put the suspect and you between the two vehicles. That's an old school thing that some people used to, like, go back to the police car with the suspect, put stuff on the hood. You stand off to the side and do that. You don't stand in the road. You don't stand in between the cars. You stand usually on the passenger side of the car, and you can put stuff on the side of the car there. But you want to be out of the way, so if somebody comes and hits the back of your police car by accident, you don't get crushed in between them or anything like that. And so these tactics are there for a reason. And one of the big ones is walking in front of a vehicle. Agents should be trained not to do that. And from what I understand, this guy was there for a while and did train people. So that said, there have been times I've seen personally officers lose their cool. And do things that they shouldn't have done, do things out of anger rather than because they're justly trying to enforce something. There also have been times I've seen officers intentionally try to entrap suspects to do stuff, trying to get people who they needed a warrant to arrest because they were in their house, trying to get them to come out in public to force them to come out in public in some way, not necessarily use force, but what I mean is like entice them somehow to come out so that they can arrest them once they get out into public. Things like that where officers have tried to entrap people. I know personally officers who have tried to get suspects to fight them by doing things they know are irritating, having a false detention, then trying to upset them and say just extremely cruel and rude things, and officers put themselves at a disadvantage to give the suspect a perfect opportunity to hit them so that they can charge them with assault on a police officer and take them to jail because ultimately they had nothing on them. I have seen those examples before. I have seen unauthorized uses of force before. I would say it is pretty rare, but it does happen, and it probably happens at every agency. But in my career, I can think of maybe a handful of times that that's happened. Would an officer ever put themselves in front of a vehicle in order to justify shooting at said vehicle because they're annoyed or irritated with the driver or occupants of the vehicle? And some people may say, hey, that's ridiculous. You're speculating. That could be, officers wouldn't do that. Well, somebody showed me this report, and I'll link to this report too. This is called the PERF report, PERF, all capital report from the Border Patrol. Now, what's important to note is this ICE agent was employed at the Border Patrol at the time that this happened. Border Patrol and ICE are both under DHS, and there are some policy recommendations made after basically Border Patrol did an audit of use of force cases. And I'm going to read a bit of this to you guys because I think you'll find this quite shocking. But this is a specific section. It's on page 8, and it's called Shooting at Vehicles. And it gives us a brief preface here saying 15 cases were reviewed where shots were fired at or into vehicles by Border Patrol agents. Here are the observations made in those cases. Based on the review of the submitted cases, it appears that Border Patrol practices allows for shooting the driver of any vehicle that comes in the direction of agents. It is suspected that in many vehicle shooting cases, the subject driver was attempting to flee from agents who intentionally put themselves into the exit path of the vehicle, thereby exposing themselves to additional risk and creating justification for a use of deadly force. So before I go any further, there is some court cases on this idea of officer-created jeopardy, where an officer will create an emergency and use that emergency to justify a Fourth Amendment violation, be it a use of force, a search, an entry, or something like that. That does happen. That is something that is still going through court cases. There have been court cases that rule on both sides, favor of the officer and of the suspects in these cases, but just that is something I want to introduce to you here. The idea of an officer-created emergency, officer-created jeopardy, or an officer-created exigency. An officer puts themselves intentionally in a situation they know that now that they're here, they can articulate using deadly force in this situation. That is what was happening at Border Patrol. So let's continue. In most of these cases, the agents have stated that they were shooting at the driver of the vehicle that was coming at them and posing an imminent threat to their life. In some cases, passengers were struck by the agent's gunfire. Little focus has been placed on the defensive tactics that could have been used by the agents that were shooting, it says shooting agents, but it's the agents that were shooting, such as simply getting out of the way. It should be recognized that a 200-grain bullet is unlikely to stop a 4,000-pound moving vehicle. If the driver of the approaching vehicle is disabled by a bullet, the vehicle will become a totally unguided threat. Obviously, shooting at a moving vehicle can pose risk to bystanders, including other agents. The cases suggest that some of the shots at suspect vehicles were taken out of frustration when agents who were on foot have no other way of detaining suspects who are fleeing in the vehicle. Most reviews cases involved nonviolent suspects who posed no other threat other than a moving vehicle. There is little doubt that the safest course for an agent faced with an oncoming vehicle is to simply get out of the way. And then talks about a policy here. Border Patrol policy should be, quote, agents shall not discharge their firearms at or from moving vehicles unless deadly force or deadly physical force is being used against the officer or another person present by means other than a moving vehicle. And then training and policy changes should be implemented to implement this policy. Now, if we go down to the bottom, the next section, this is actually a section about throwing rocks at agents. I'm not going to read into that, but they have a note at the bottom where they made some more observations about these situations with agents. And they note, it is clear, based on this report, that agents are unnecessarily putting themselves in situations to expose them to a higher risk. And then it continues, agents need to train agents, or Border Patrol needs to train agents to de-escalate these encounters by taking cover, moving out of range, using less lethal weapons. Agents should not place themselves into a position where they have no alternative but to use deadly force. So this is a really interesting report here from the Border Patrol, because it is showing these unethical and immoral behaviors, and these absolutely do happen in law enforcement. Now let's talk about this specific Minnesota shooting. I'm not claiming that this is what that officer did. Certainly he probably has seen some of this, whether he wants to recognize it as what it is or not. But certainly he's been around at these agencies when these policies have been put in place. Certainly he's had officer safety training to tell him not to move in front of a vehicle. So when I look at this and I see what's going on, a lot of people are saying agents were doing their job and she rammed into them. That didn't happen. She didn't randomly come and just slam into agents that were there. That did not happen. They're saying that she boxed them in and cornered them in. This was a 2-lane, one-way street, so there's 2 lanes going the same way, parking on both sides. She was obstructing the right lane. She was not obstructing the left lane. You see a video. There is a video now from farther away. You can see vehicles continually passing her. Even in the videos that initially came out, there's a Border Patrol agent that passes her on the way out. The agent that shot her went actually behind her on the shoulder of the road and parked next to her, also slightly obstructing the right lane before he got out of the car. The next thing I noticed with the video is he gets out of the vehicle and he walks right in front of her vehicle, taking video of her, and they're having some sort of conversation. It sounds, I can kind of assume that he's saying like he's going to be talking to them later, so he wants to get a license plate, get her face and all that stuff. Her last words to him that we can hear in the video are, something to the effect of, "That's fine, dude, I'm not mad at you." Not exactly the words of somebody who is hellbent on killing an agent, and not exactly the words I would suspect from a terrorist about to commit a domestic terrorism, which we're throwing around the word domestic terrorism way too easily these days. I don't know how many conservatives forgot that the last administration, basically anybody who had the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, the Gadsden flag, was considered potentially a domestic terrorist. So we're just throwing around that word way too easily. I don't think this even remotely comes close to terrorism. The next thing I noted with that is when he gets out of the car the first time, he walks around her vehicle. What does she do? She backs her car all the way up to basically the shoulder of the road. He did not ask her to move. She moved on her own to get out of his way. My question is, that was a perfect opportunity for her to run him over, and she chose not to. He walked around the back of the vehicle. As he walked around the back, she pulls forward again a little bit, and he's talking to the other female that's on the side of the car. Some people say, oh, they're paid protesters to harass and all that. I get it. That's stupid. I disagree with what they're doing. I am completely against this paid protests and all these riots and all that stuff. But the fact of the matter is, they weren't doing anything that I think was outside of their rights of protesting. They can film, they can yell, they can show up, they can follow them around in public. The only thing I could argue is that she was obstructing the right lane of traffic, but that's a traffic infraction. It's actually not a crime. It's a traffic infraction. It's not a misdemeanor or felony. You don't go to jail. You get a ticket. There's no victim in that particular case. That said, the agents were not trapped. This wasn't a false imprisonment case like people are making it sound like. The agents couldn't leave. They were leaving. The agents that got out of the truck chose to stop. They had more than enough room to go. And when the first vehicle in the early videos goes by, she's waving at it. When the agent's truck is coming up, she's waving at it to go past her too. They're telling them to leave. They don't want them to stay. They're not trying to trap there. They're clearly telling the agents, get out of our neighborhood, or get out of this neighborhood, or whatever they're saying. Leave, go home. And that's kind of the other lady's insult to him. So he walks around the car. The agent that shoots goes back into his car, presumably to leave. And then the truck comes up and the other agents want to detain her. They say, get out of the car, get the F out of the car, go up. And he immediately tries to pull open the door and try to get in there. The other thing that I noticed when he came up to do that is going to be your detention right there. At that point, it is not just a consensual encounter. He's detaining her. He's trying to get her out of the car. So my question is, what justification does he have for that detention? How is he going to articulate that detention? Because what follows that detention is going to be based on that initial stop. So is it going to be something as petty as she was slightly obstructing the right lane of traffic? Or is there something else that we don't know, that we haven't seen? I don't know. But that's something I want answered, because I don't know if this stop was justified or not, or if this agent was just trying to like teach her a lesson because he got so annoyed and pissed at all these protesters, and he's going to teach this lady a lesson. So we really don't know what's going on there. But he's trying to get her out of the car. Now, as that is happening simultaneously, the other agent that shoots, he gets out of his car and he again walks in front of her car. Now, I've watched this several times over again. If you watch, he walks in front of her car, she backs up, and when she stops to back up, he starts to draw his gun. Around the time that she backs up very shortly. That is one thing too I want to bring up. She backs up. Why doesn't she just pull forward right into him? She's already in drive. She's stopped right there. Why doesn't she pull forward, or why does she bother backing up at all? My instinct tells me it is because she is trying to get away from the agents. She wants to back away from the agents and then pull away from them. So to me, the fact that she backs up, and also in his cell phone video, you can see her cranking the wheel to the right away from the agents. That's evidence to me that she's trying to get away and not target the agents. So this isn't to say that this is a dangerous situation. It is a dangerous situation. But the claim that she intentionally tried to hit them, or that this is some sort of attempt homicide, I think is completely unfounded. When he walks in front of the vehicle and he starts to draw his gun, he takes like a half step to the right and kind of turns as she pulls out, but he does not continue walking. He was walking in front of the vehicle and he stops in order to shoot. At the time that his first shot was taken, he had drawn and pointed at her for a second before firing. At the moment he fired, the vehicle was clear of him. You can see both his legs on the driver's side of the vehicle. He's kind of leaning over toward the windshield, and he shoots one round through the windshield, and then as the vehicle passes him, he shoots 2 rounds through the driver's window. To me, this is exactly what his policy and prohibits. This is exactly what the law has said, or what these articles have said, and what a lot of these cases have said is a very controversial thing. So I find it that, like, if he would have just kept moving and kept walking, he would have been fine. And in fact, he was fine. He didn't get hit by he didn't get run over. He didn't get seriously injured by this car or anything like that. And he stopped. If he would have just continued, he would have been very clear of the car, had more than enough clearance. And in fact, the agent that had probably a higher chance of getting injured was the agent that was trying to open her door. Because if he would have got stuck somehow there and got dragged by the vehicle, he would have been in a much more dangerous position than the other agent. But he was able to let go, and the vehicle obviously continued and crashed into a parked car and pole. So in my eyes, is this a legally justified shooting? I'd say this is very, very iffy. It is very murky. If I were on this case, I would say no. I would vote no. I don't think this is a justified shooting. I think he went arguably He stopped the action, which was walking past the vehicle. First off, he put himself in front of the vehicle, and he shouldn't have done that. That was really stupid. Second off, as he was walking, he stopped to draw his gun and shoot instead of continuing walking. All in all, in this case, I think this shooting was completely unnecessary. I think it was not smart on the officer's part to put themselves in that situation. I think that ultimately the one who probably caused this was the agent who got out of the truck. I hope he has a really good reason for making that stop, because somebody is dead because of it. And ultimately, this is a really tragic situation, you guys. This is just a terrible situation. But what I am shocked with is how people are painting her as this, second Osama bin Laden kind of, she's a domestic terrorist. She's doing all these things. First off, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter. Let's say she was registered as a domestic terrorist. Let's say she legitimately was. Her actions need to warrant the action response from the officers. And I just don't see that here. Knowing what you guys know now about vehicles versus officers, I don't see that here. And I would speculate that, could these officers have intentionally put themselves in this situation knowing it was unsafe, and that it could end up in this situation and they just didn't care? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. That's a question I want to know too. But, they're never going to admit that if that's the case, of course. But that said, at what point did the right start to trust the government? At what point did we believe the government was without corruption? You can be of the opinion that, ICE is a necessary agency, illegal immigration is a huge problem in our country, but that this particular incident, ICE screwed up, and this shouldn't have happened. And a lot of people are, well, what about Ashley Babbitt? What about this? What about Ashley Babbitt? Shouldn't have got shot either. Both of those, I think, were unjust. But at what point did we start blindingly trust and supporting the government on this? And yeah, it's just not a good situation all around, you guys. And I definitely don't think it is clear cut. The people who are saying it is clear cut, I think it's the farthest from it. I think it's very, very murky, and I just happen to be leaning on the side of this shouldn't have happened, because he should have known better. Legally, do I think he'll get charged with it? I would be very surprised if he gets charged with anything. And if he did get charged, I would be extremely surprised if he got convicted of anything. But at most, can I see like a policy violation on there when they do their internal review? Maybe, but I don't know. It depends on how politically involved everybody is, because everybody may take his side just to defend the right in this case, right? The whole Trump administration, MAGA movement, they're going to support him because he kind of represents that in this case. But hopefully this stuff was useful for you guys and shed some light on some things maybe that you didn't know earlier, and gives you guys some other things to think about. Let me know if you have any other observations or any other questions, comments about this down below. And that's it. Take care, you guys. God bless.